This wasn't one of your usual brawls.
Now he wants to become president of the United States.
HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. I've been working since I was 15, at a variety of different jobs and a variety of different capacities, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs at a time. That's given me a lot of learning opportunities. One thing I've noticed is that corporations in every field I've encountered have one issue in common. Policy written at the corporate level often makes absolutely no sense when applied to real-life workplace situations. I've seen such policy directly result in workplace accidents and injuries, staff infighting, wasted time, consumer dissatisfaction, and even fines by government agencies for violating known regulations. One of the dumbest examples of this that I've had to deal with involved a planogram I was given to follow, a simple map for where to place items in a display. It sounds really cut and dried, but actually a lot of things can go wrong due to failure to consider factors present in the display or store, but not in the design area, where the process often starts with a template based on beliefs about the stereotypical outlet space and the consumer. In this instance, marketing took a shortcut. On paper, they straightened out the front of a dramatically curved shelf and made a planogram that was physically impossible to apply to the real-world display case. They'd failed to consider product's width at the back, designing only for the length of the front of the shelf. My store's manager didn't want to know what the problem was. She refused to even look, ordered me to fill the shelf, then tried to blame me when the regional manager came in and asked why the product wasn't all there. When I was confronted, it took me less than 2 minutes to get him to see the problem and take steps to fix it. After he left, my manager accused me of going over her head and wrote me up for insubordination. Of course, as a food service worker, I had the ability to just abandon that job for another one, and eventually I did exactly that. In light of that and similar experiences, I used to joke to my coworkers that I'd developed a theory that all corporations have a secret room full of chimpanzees on acid to which they give paper and crayons. Whatever they draw becomes policy. I always insisted that the government also keeps a room like that. They call it Congress. Of course, the monkeys and the acid are metaphors for corporate policymakers' ignorance of the real-world environment in which their policies are to be practically applied. Middle management is then put in the position of dealing with the conflict between bad policy and impossible real-world application. Often they don't understand either side of the issue, resent the employee for exposing the problem, and respond with authoritarian abuse like I faced. This isn't all that different from the path between federal law and policy and its practical application in the real world. It often starts with stereotypes and templates as well, and failure to take variables into consideration can lead to its practical application landing far, far away from its stated goals. We talk a lot about gynocentrism and feminist activism informing law and policy, and those are still major factors. But one of the things that facilitates them is that huge legislator to ordinary citizen disconnect. Take, for example, in the U.S., Joe Biden's Violence Against Women Act of 1994. Its creation was influenced by domineering violent barbarian stereotypes based on faulty data and feminist dogma. Those stereotypes act as a cushion between legislators' observation of their own experiences and data that doesn't jive with those observations. Of course, there must be domineering violent barbarians behind this phenomenon, because how else would it exist in a world full of men who would never do that and can't consider the possibility that there are ordinary men and women who do, or that the data that they're considering is flat out wrong. As a result, while VAWA's supporters claim it is a gender-neutral law, its text is littered with gendered language designed to imply that perpetrators are male and victims are female. It funds training based on those stereotypes for all levels of the justice system, designed to eliminate consideration for contributing variables in any real-world situation. While legislators who voted for it may have intended it as a means of protecting citizens or providing recourse for victims of intimate partner and sexual violence, it ended up facilitating false allegations and eliminating existing recourse for male victims of female perpetrators. Not only are men and teen boys denied equal access to federally funded services for victims of family violence, organizations that want to provide service to them are actually shut out of most federal funding by government agency administrators interpreting the law based on its gendered language, or even their own personal biases. Similarly, the Bipartisan Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, originally proposed by Republicans, was partly influenced by deadbeat dad and abandoned struggling single mother stereotypes that stem from society's overall gynocentrism. Among the drawbacks of that package was its assumption that welfare dependence by single mothers would end if they received support from their children's fathers. The law's, quote, solution was to pay states what is essentially a collections bounty for the pursuit of child support payment from estranged fathers. The idea that there could be single mothers by choice and fathers alienated from their children against their will wasn't even considered, because it didn't fit the legislators' biases. This led to states finding creative ways to shoehorn all child support payment through agency collections in order to milk the federal funding cow, but it didn't significantly reduce welfare dependence or even necessarily increase child support obligor compliance. Additionally, it incentivized state abuse of obligors, leading to refusal to consider things like involuntary job loss or disability in the determination of one's obligation. Penalties for inability to pay include things that negatively impact the obligor's employability, like wage garnishment, confiscation of his driver's license, and incarceration. As a result, penalized obligors end up ensnared in a cycle of poverty and condemnation during which they often end up being part-time wards of the state at taxpayer expense, while the mothers of their children continue to rely on welfare, also at taxpayer expense. These are huge disconnects between the legislators' promises and the practical application of law and policy, and it leaves government employees, the middle management of the United Corporation of America, in no position to exercise or appreciate common sense. The result can range from crippling their work to inspiring or at least enabling authoritarian abuse of citizens. Unfortunately, unlike corporate peons, citizens generally can't go find another government. We're stuck with the United Corporation of America, and in a way, we're not just the peons, we're also the product. Our future earnings, along with those of our children and grandchildren, have for decades been mortgaged by our legislators to support these and other similarly bad initiatives. We the people have literally funded our nation's own descent into corporate hell. In that way, we're pretty much the same as the majority of nations around the world. The disconnect that leads to dysfunctional law and policy is only breached when a lot of voters complain quite noticeably, either publicly or directly to legislators about the same things in mostly the same way. And then, all too often, the proposed solution suffers from the same disconnect-related issues that the original problem had. Part of the reason is, of course, that a central or federal government is attempting to control social issues at the local level using a central or federal authority, instead of leaving the handling of these issues to local communities where nuance can be properly considered. This cannot be done without relying on templates and stereotypes that will fail in practical application a significant portion of the time. That's one of the major causes behind the issues faced by men and boys in relation to intimate partner and sexual violence, family law, and criminal justice administration. It's why our public education system is leaving so many boys behind and funneling so many into the criminal justice system. This doesn't mean that the entire men's rights movement has to become citizens of Ancapistan, though there would be sense in doing something like that, and to disclose my bias, you all know my bags are already packed. I see the elimination of federal control over most aspects of American life as a pathway to eliminating discrimination against men, as it is easier to hold local authorities accountable or voluntarily work with neighbors to solve a problem than it is to even connect with administrators and legislators at the federal level and get reasonable results. That doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means it can't be done easily. And of course, there is also the issue that the federal government is not just going to spontaneously give up its existing level of control. That leads to the other means by which men's rights activism can achieve real-world reform. That'd be the choice of turning the system back on itself by becoming involved with it. Obviously, that can take the pathway of gaining access and dismantling its structure as libertarians, anarchists, and other individualists would prefer. But it can also take the form of controlling the existing system as the more collectivist segments of the movement would prefer. In the short term, either of those two outcomes would be better for men than the current situation. For either method to work, however, men's rights activists would have to be willing to engage in constant vigilance, or we would just see the old gynocentric system rather quickly reestablished. In terms of working with the existing system, this would mean active lobbying, litigation, and hardest of all, MRAs running for and winning political offices. The first two exist in groups like the National Coalition for Men, which has engaged in both, and various fathers' rights groups which have pushed for equally shared parenting bills that would help eliminate discrimination against dads in family court. Government service is a different story, as that would involve MRAs actually getting into politics and succeeding in order to impact the legislative process in favor of gender neutrality. Few have tried, and fewer have been successful at it. Any pathway, individualist, collective, or a mix of the two, would rely on our ideas being known and understood well enough by enough of the public to make "I'm going to address these men's issues with legislative reform" a viable campaign promise. Simply put, if we want sustainable services for abused men, we must work to make our communities willing to support them, willing enough to get mad if their nation's government openly hinders their existence. If we want consistent and fair consequences for false allegations, we must work at making the behavior so socially unacceptable that legislators and the human cogs and wheels of justice systems are embarrassed to be seen condoning it. If we want equal parenting rights and responsibility, if we want equal reproductive rights and responsibility, we must fight to close the gap in personal accountability between men and women, to make it normal for people to recognize and object to ways that society has been transferring it from women to men. That is what makes men's rights-focused media, conferences and meetups, public demonstrations, and social media discussion so important. These are influences on public knowledge and social attitudes that will increase the potential for success in any other effort the movement supports. That is why our opponents, particularly those whose living is made monopolizing and exploiting financial resources in women's names, fight so hard to imply that these activities are meaningless and without impact, because making MRAs afraid to engage with each other and the public in these ways would hamstring the entire movement. They're protecting their control over their cash cow, and the fastest way they could prevent us from challenging that control is to deprive the movement's boots-on-the-ground activism of any advocate support. Public advocacy is one of our greatest weapons. Anyone can use it, whether you're able to engage in any other form of activism or not, and when you do, you're helping to pave the road for every other activist on the team. Do not let anyone trick you into giving that up. This week on HBR Talk, we'll be practicing what we preach in recognition and defense of the power and value of public advocacy. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options for that time or later on badgerfeed.com.